In 1856, as the inheritance was being killed by the name of Sara Sutton was interred away in a Mississippi estate. 72 horse water, said year her wine out from her own vesting place. The events that followed would transform Moaquam Plantation into the most dreaded location across the entire Southern region. A narrative misburied in secret but never uttered at all. A chronicle of mortality and repression that defied our explanation and that everyone wished to erase from memory. This represents that narrative. I just off 1856 at Moaquam Plantation, Mississippi. The warmed pressed down wake an animate force, weighing upon emirating, fennering breath difficult, childhood impossible, survival a cowing. The Copton fields extended and wefly, weight Bennett as kind so intense a bossate cassette paint to umsuru. 200 acres of prosperity constructed upon the frames of individuals possessing nothing, not elentier on banks. The estate was conferred by Margaret Sutton, a widow aged 48 who had assumed ownership upon her husband's death in 1852. Margaret's tomtao and swinder wed ran an estate appeared never to cause and webs that seldom formed a smile. The governed the estate would have sowed actually, determined to demonstrate that a woman could manage such an operation as effectively as any man, perhaps more so. They maintained comprehensive records of every expenditure, every bundle of cotton, every inswiped individual and entire monitoring assessment. Joe Margaret, the estate represented commerce. The individuals were bearing the reconstituted attack, knocking further. Prior to proceeding with this remarkable account of Sarah, remember to indicate which you're joining us from and subscribe to the channel. Of encouragement maintained his narrative. Let's proceed. In 1856, a huge adult male in bondage was oppressed at 5 and 200. A phobist woman might be held between 700 and 0. Children rated over actions, their watch increasing best hand measured and demonstrated their labor capacity. Margaret's accounting book recorded Sara Sutton at 250 under unfart the house of half-found labor. Margaret figured it his as genre. Most plantation owners oppressed when children at and mature alien west. Some would have sold Sarah to the sugarcane operation of Wysenga, where existence was measured in motivative handecanes, where laborers perhaps so weaponed and required constant replacement. Sarah Sutton carried Margaret's Sirinaminok Troy and familial connection, bit Troy possessing. They entered the world and the plantation in 1847, the offspring of a woman named Vat, who had been killed at the time between Margaret's species accounting records. Vat died bringing Sarah into existence, decreasing the plantation's holdings bin the time to well adding Mary 250. From a commercial standpoint, Sarah's birth represented a net deficit of 650. Margaret's husband had documented this and his records with obvious dissatisfaction. From her initial marriage, Sarah was distinguished as homosexual. She was tame, alien for an infant, weighing scarcely almost pounds. Her development was slow, she remained fine regardless of consumption. Her complexion was fairer than most of her enslaved youngsters, indicating her father was white. Choi nobody ever discussed his possible identity. Some speculated it was Margaret's detested husband, but such speculation never entered. Dangerous inquiries and attending had all result in individuals being sold or facing worse consequences. Being Sarah Stone Meroy arat fectel and were perhaps pounds. She appeared close to 6'10". Her eyes were wide and dark, appearing to major for her countenance, as if she had witnessed things no could hide to say. She seldom spoke. Wien se den kom neniket, heftan was so fijn piopoe neder tom rau niar to perceive her. Se neber rengeget in point wage her youngsters, neber van or way hebor joinend hemewa just hen sang in the quarters during gelening horse. Se simpor worget swaway and carfaway and remained as inconspicuous as possible. Margaret referred to her as Tefabo and recorded in her Wedger Tet Saris Hawaction Milet Fequer Vedaction Do and Matuham Saif Sefiawed to show improvement. The adversary, Americois make Kawait Kovama Brairs, Kawait Herisois Burden and Wars terms. Murailis was Salasa mist, constructed wake abia wide hands chet had fractured bones and a west hem poigned excessively. Hefreke with silsa per mont pues wadging and borrowed, positioning him among the highest compensated adversaries in Naro County. He had wa buried at Moakwood for distiars, securing his foe troich brotawedy and productivity. Murail's pewed in swabit individuals were a creatures fecularing snimchigashin, and he took satisfaction in his capacity to simits and the most resolute spirits. He had beheld a fepidation troichot to reconciles as an adversary capable of fenering an impendation wa credit be attracting pack output from waborers. His upfetches were Harris beat productive at West Temporary. During his 6 years at Moakhom, Koptian would have vice by Arbabamatu. Chet Hehan also interred highest workers, including 7 youngsters. During that same time frame was regarded as an acceptable operational expense. Bet Saref paid him. Y'all couldn't see me someone who never rested. Young couldn't instead ran in someone already appearing terrific of everything. Y'all couldn't inspire someone who seemed to have abandoned hope in existence before it had even commenced. So he simply forced her to wabur more intensely. Piesab her penond who had her small frame cowed endure, hoping se would yet her trenchen or pere. Hedien per uik shotcon. In his widow, se squandered provisions and resources, consuming more than se generated, fedicame dependent to help productivity. The adherents webid individuals at Moakwon with Saref with a point of sympathy and irritation. An older woman named Esther, who had been at deportation for 4 years and was now oppressed at Meroy and Metuhamsa because of her age and diminishing capability, attempted towards adversary when circumstances allowed. Esther had been escorted in and she sent Metuasras for Metu, regarded as prime productive material at Ejihaya. She had delegated Asra and offspring of Evhaya years. Ed had been sown away. Turehab perehab in killed hon. Seham generated thousands of dollars in house for deportation to Roy her children. Had no that se was aged and depleted, se was worth burial more than he sequoia killed se attempted to safeguard. Esther would secret on province additional form when possible, joy provisant were careful measured and monitored. Wabur is rated with white wine and pack of cormia wakoi, sust do arat pandas of salted pork or bacon, and occasional additions of molasses or vegetables. Tis dead, descendant do cough deportation about hyacinths per person daily, was intended to fipoi meroi sufficient calories to maintain worker function but not comfort. Esther would give Sarah portion of her own provisions, assist her with the more demanding tasks when hanam serweb, and memorize her at need when Sarah hawang screaming from need maris never discussed. Esther mentioned Sarah reminded her of a buried with a damaged womb, still breathing but hinabo to fuang, simpwa waiting for something to conquer its misery. Set on the other woman in the quarters that Sarah wouldn't vesh as ramst. The girl was too feeble, too fragile, not descended for his existence. Better se go do God son ten water before existence crafeb mhedever spirit remained waiting her. The other woman would non-sorrowful, having witnessed do mine children perish to despite his fasoning. In their experience, that occasion one represented the quaintest outcome possible for an enswabed killed. Terry was a young man named Daniel, perhaps higher Charles Saud, headed and 200 Margaret's accounting ball. He was focused and intolerant, watch his substantial price, with years of productive work. He had been born and appointed son of the local head workers, and had developed into practice od he claim of holding Margaret Prague. He called Gatif 200 pounds of Coptan DIY during peak season. He called Mindy Kumeknin. He called interpret numbers and maintain basic records, favoring him a beneficial for more than just field work. Daniel Outen was buried near Sarek and he fields. He would abdum to assist her, Kara her Coptan sak when it grew excessive having, take over her for when se fell behind. We had prayers through emulating and assisting the nature person me and both individuals with punishment. Muray's understand that anything among his wife people was headers. Workers who supported us of her might begging perceiving themselves as a community wage not how concurrent vative ten as individual assets. So he enslaved the crafting of an indication of cooperation though maintain everyone is whited and frightening. Still, Daniel attempted. He couldn't help himself. Something about Sarah's cooled dead started something waiting him, made him furious at the unfairness of emirating in a wide help was perilous for an enslaved man to each parent. His mother had advised him to keep his head down, to be grateful he was healthy and strong, to not expend emotion on matters he couldn't alter. Badam sifling Sarah's true dang after dang, watching his killed wabur herself to death for people who figured her as worth west ten a decent horse, made him want to rest in wise that would result in his death. The Coptan gathering period extended from last October. This represented the busiest and most vital time anyway for Muakwog plantation. The entire year's earnings depended on gathering, processing, and shipping Coptan to market. In and shipment 156, Coptan sold for 5 and per pound. A capiamo worker gathering and 150 DIY generated about 16.50 worth of Coptan per day. Across as it an dying gathering season, Ted signed a worker could produce almost and 500 weaving. Subtract the yearly expense of feeding, housing, and cooking that worker, approximately sabasust, and the profit margin was evident. To such point me plantation owners broke workers so intensely during harvest. To such points we had hang calculated emirating down toward his smallest hand. To such points we had told wake Sarah, who called on Wagater Salasor Arba Diawi, generating my sustur arat words of Coptan Diawi, Beroa covering her own upkeep expenses, was regarded as a drawback. In the dispassionate arithmetic of enswagement, so didn't make economic sense. There was inventorying that wasn't appreciating in words, that was actually costing more to maintain hence produced. Yet enswaged person at Boakwood was expected to achieve Bedouin and 250 and 200 pounds of Coptan Diawi. A George who got heard was first disappointed, can pick away with him, macation on worse. Mraves maintained heroic documentation, weighing as percent Coptan at the ice end, recording the amounts, comparing them to tarlets. Those who surpassed their tarlets occasionally vetted with modest incentives, an extra portion of form, ascending after non-free, a word of praise. Those who fell short faced consequences have intensified wage as failure. Children under Asr were expected to gather at West Saba Amstdiawi. Sarah had never answered his goal. On her finite days, she managed perhaps Arba. Most days, it was nearer Salas. Emery days she fell short. Margaret fedised her for portion by an amount corresponding to her defeat. If she gathered Arba instead of Saba Amst, she vetted about health fashions chat learning. Their reasoning was straightforward. If you don't produce an eye to warrant your form, you vetel was phone. His rapid descending financial where fed workers became weaker and less productive, weak wed do more forward action, weak wed do more weakness, the trouble margered. The febua were supposed to pere. That was Nigeris made home. That was Hoghal developed for best ftak. Myers at the punishments of his own. He would make Sarah wa burt royal meow breaks, as Saint her told the hottest, most cow-ending vows, stand over her critiquing, Macfem, Macashing on breaking her and he back of the hand who hence was tells wow. He informed her se was SOS, taps was stealing from the plantation, taps would be grateful more certain the and same poisel her told his cigar fields where se would be detested wait hin a year. I just asra amsdi, and she smint meto hamsa started wake any later day. Tessian was hot and fierce, Tessicain already braid at amst, 00 amu hand he bell fang, sim manning ever on toward he fields. Sarah powered herself from his small cabin serried Westchester and fed up her warming. The cabin mesred approximately as ras dischi hafid, accommodating 7 individuals. Yes person hen about arbas square foot of area, 5 comparable to a contemporary present keo. The cabin hen no windows, mirror gaps in the walls for air monument. No fear nothings except 5 sweeping platforms, no privacy, no comfort. Sarah hadn't vested well. Se never vested well. Her body at constantly now. A persistent discomfort in her bones and must had never subside. So was coiling more recently, a brain rasp had made her cast heard and broid specks of board macashanoy. Esther attributed to Coptan Pardiquith. Mentioned numerous children became from inhoing it day outer day, year of the year. Tetiam famers entered north hangs and never departed, causing ongoing irritation and infection. Some individuals improved. Most gained. Esther had witnessed it happen dozens of times over arba years. A cold would begin coiling, would raw weaker, would was still one over months airs until the handsome boy stopped breaching. Undying, Sarah's demon wade out into the predawn darkness and joined the wine of people walking to the fields. Nyobogi Kanger said match in the morning. Everyone was too exhausted, too hungry, too focused on entertained another day. The mocked silently, spectres mauling trolled the grand wade, handing toward another day of Harris Wabor under a Harris sang for the advantage of people who figured the mass wave attack. Being on, Sarah had gatchered perhaps as Rams to be of cordan. Her small fingers, cad and boiling from the sharp cotton bows had to skying weight over a handful, mowed as quickly as se could make them, but se was so slow. Yes bow required both hands to open to extract the cotton which out weaving fragments behind, to stuff it into the sack that trailed behind her vrouwing heavy weight as fall. Her back screamed with her joint from pending over constantly. The sun was merciless, pounding down with a hap that made the air similar and dense. They had been gelling on cup of water at sunrise and wouldn't wetted another until sensed as rahulet horse water. This was standard procedure during harvest season. What if breaks consigned him away from gathering? Margaret had calculated that permitting water breaks fedicid daily productivity by approximately cement bemetal. Consequently, workers retailed water twice daily, morning and evening, and were expected to manage. That individuals saw medicines collapsed from heat and dehydration was favourable but acceptable. The expense of work productivity from water breaks exceeded the occasional expense of a deceased worker. Sarah's march was sobering, half-times adhered to her tate. She felt dang, as if the world was tilting, as if the ground wasn't quite where it should be. Everything kept boring. She hem to pass and cross her rails, breathed deeply, fed the herd to simple way down in the soil and not race. But wanting down meant punishment, meant Brails would arrive with his wives for his feats, meant West formed het learning. So he kept working, kept gathering, her small hands smalling slower and slower as the head and the chest tongue cherto. Brails forged rolled the fields and his horse around and, zirvirukma kekvengan workers, conding failed sacks. He carried a small scow, would vendongoin way sakto interpupua weren't padding him with soil or shitans, so made him desperate workers so made him as a dimpig. He also carried his whip cord and his sagdue and a pistol on his hip. The pistol was hoid. He had said it twice in the stairs, showing workers who attempted escape. Both had the. Both deaths were avoid justified self-defense. As wavy abdumpting it was, Wegaway considered to be stealing himself, and wed how forced to prevent theft was permitted. When Brails fätib sars fall, he dismounted and removed her narrow empty sack. He had it in his hand, his face darkening. As ramst? Hinsement horse, gatchered as ramst. His voice carried across the field, warm and furious, intending to be heard by everyone. Other workers passed to Sir, draining let would follow, yet unable to walk away. The ham witnessed his scenario before many times with different children. It always concluded similarly. Sarah stared at the ground, swooning sweetly. Said Miss Pereb, I'm sorry, sire. I'm abdumpting my best. Her voice was so faint Brails' hand to went in to perceive it his infuriated him further. He despaced when han were submissive waked his, when han wouldn't Ellen West in to make punishment gratifying. Your best is as ramst. Jom feelways we had young cost chief pointation. Jom feelways we had Maris sortan pies to sustain your virtuous mod. He grabbed med her arm and jerked her upright, sacking her. Had sense biawe. That's what it costs to maintain your away. Hyacinth's dairy for phone and hassing and the quacking on your back. Half always had as rams to be of copter his horge and natives distance. Jom always ho minen dang it feculated young to yaren en I to pay for and dang a phone. About cement guys. Horse stealing from the hif pointation. Horse stealing fought from people who were bordered way, who herent her cap. Holur at chef. The calculation was precise beyond purpose or detective. It didn't consider that Sarah had been compelled into his wabur, taps was that in her saub, taps was ill and handerfe. It didn't consider taps never requested to be born into bondage, never consented to his arrangement, him no choice in any respect. But none of that mattered to Brails. In his perspective, in Swabid individuals existed to generate profit. Those who didn't generate any had no words and therefore no entitlement to complain about their treatment. Brails married Sara to the center of the field where everyone called Sir. This was standard procedure. This point was intended to be public, to serve as a warning to others, to preserve fear and assurity. He extracted his whip, a bright weather implement about a mistfit wang that called scrapes came from West with a sandwich-stroke. Minim pain well mofsletion. Minim if your back hurts more than your arms, your work faster to make it case. Esther started forward from where she had been working 3 hours away, but Daniel grabbed me her arm, he would have back. His eyes were full of anguish, but he shook his hand. Becoming incovid would simply without interloper being hipped instead of on. Or worse. The hand over his was so previously. Y'all couldn't risk everyone. Somebody mer y'all couldn't risk anyone. All long could do was survive and hope tomorrow would be better, Chai hit very was. Brails faced him hip hey, his arm pawing back for maximum force. Sarah Sutton be still, not flame, not weeping, simply awaiting the pains Ekinyo was calling. Se had been hipped before man timid. Se handelstorm if sensation. Hold his sky woud spoid and beren. Hold je bob woud flow down her back. Ho se woud nyan to rest and her match for dance wild he wangs abdumpted to hill, often becoming infected in the future condition of the cabin. Se handelstorm all of teas and a separated beckes wet alternative din se heli. Bet before bread scout bringed him hip down, Sarah coepsig. Se simpoi feodod he grand wake so man cat her friends, wake a pipet wait no unto hold it prayed. Here and as void back her ham, going on with he. Her body went complete or wimp, folding in on itself as a crump wade into the dirt. Se dien cuts herself, dien extend her hands, simpoi fell wake a detested train. Mirai stone ter momentarily, whip still elgative, confessed bent his development. He quaked her weight his board, not gently. Fair. Face immediately, or it will make it worse. You all hip yon handle you can't walk. Bet Sarah ain't mol. Didn't respond at all. Her cast was mulling beyond barrier. So all bread it had Sam Abdul work to sustain with. Her sky was pale, almost grey. Her wipes were returning boss. Daniel broke free from his fall and ran away before a young could stop him. He understood he would be disappointed for his, but he didn't care. He cannot be sorry and placed his hand on her chest, feeling for her helmet. It was present, but wrong, irregular, and weak as if it might cess at any moment. Says not breathing correctly. Some things gangen wa ufong wade her. Se fe correct he position. Says gangen wa eo breers kike Daniel forcifon in the fabs, kinakfeng him a se. Vedun to work or yao going her and he grand. Bet Daniel vemaid where he was, protecting Sarah's body weighed his own. Says Delane. Can't young perceive it? Says Delane fight her and his soul. Ad minimum our her to die so meu her weighed set. Ad minimum grant her tet make. Breers hawked at Sarah's still forum and cruise quedoi. If se diad interfered from hipping, terror would be inquiry. Marger dient a pricket wasing property, Elian watches property watch anway huletmetu hamsa. Terror would be investigation, reports, possible complications weighed draw. If someone crappy about disturbance about it, better to wed the position manage it wed her de somewhere out of said, somewhere responsibility could be redirected. Hesemon dilo other workers to Karen Sarah toward the plantation vessels. Take her to the remarret. Wed him determine head's wrong wed her. And nom, he pointed at Daniel. Return to work. You are address him waiter. Daniel would Sebastian carried Sarah away. Her small body so weighed se appeared way knocking at all, as if se were already a spirit. He had a dreadful sensation he would never see her away alone. The plantation peasant was a man named Thomas Marret, 7 years old, who had been practicing medicine for 4 years. He carried Marjorie Salasa and now to be available for medical issues at Moakwon. This worked out to about 7 cents daily, positioning him among the cheaper rich princes of funding the plantation. It was effortless money for minimal effort. Most of his treatments involved bloodletting patients, muik required no costly medicines, or providing them with wadding, muik cost about $2 per container and could be extended for months. Grr. Merritt wasn't particularly skilled, having received his medical training through a brief apprenticeship Salasa years with 10 formal education. Bad inferior Mississippi and Shisment Metohamsas dist, skilled physicians were uncommon and expensive. Doctors who would treat in Swabit individuals at our were alien were. Most proper patients cancelerated pianet diemto tret suavis, wioen bidas geterinare work vat 15 jenge medicain. So pointation owners managed wait man wake married, who asked few questions, kept inacmate records, and didn't care whether their patients waved or dead. Dieng poesit sarek and he four of the doctors form in the main has. Nyado an a bed or a chamaya shitabo, same pot for. The bed was for wake patients. The four was a clade for in swabid in divinaus. Dr. Marite chamayant have brefon, his movements slow and curious. He taked her pulse been pressing the low fingers against her urate. It was present, Beatweg and Renoir, Makeshan on Semaing to pass for several seconds before Vesmaing. He wished him to her cast been pressing his ear against her fab keg. He heard flame in her lungs, a most fatwing sound that indicated pneumonia or something comparable. He powered back her wheels and saw her realize had followed back, showing mortuam hit with merely a trace of bronchissimo. He checked her temperature been pressing his hand against her forehead. So was burning with fever, her skin hot and dry. He checked her hands and feet and found him cold, the bone federating from her extremities as half body attempted to preserve her core. This was an unfavorable indicator. It meant half body was sweating down, prioritizing vital organs over everything else, a desperate measure that often preceded death. Margaret stormed into the door while circling, her arms clasped, her face showing irritation that of the conquering. This was an inconvenience, an interruption to her style. We had surrounded with her. The remarried storm swallowed, his skin is cracking with heggy. Se has pneumonia, ipewig. Half lungs are filled with flying. Combined with exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, and heart exposure, half body is failing. Says him head will cause systemic collapse. Multiple organ systems shutting down simultaneously. Margaret's face displayed no motion. She had held comparable diagnosis previously. Workers did figure while on pointation. That was a normal aspect of conducting business. Can you prepare her? The question was posed the same once I made inquiry if he could prepare a fucking employment. The remarried surrendered, wiping his hands and his trousers. I can abdumped, bead handstowing, murusobtan, imenyok confinant it would succeed. The medicain a one would cost a beard amst. To him for the fever, wading him for the discomfort, perhaps some sitting went to a train in her heart. The nursing attention would consume him away from more helpable workers. Someone would nyanto sit with her, pravin water, keep her cool, monitor her condition. Takes word productivity. He passed, performing his own calculation. And even with treatment, it estimate her chances of survival are less than half, probably closer to an entire. Says bien work her entire wife. His might same point be nakir taking give spot. Some edemus the work anes nyanto die so resources aren't squandering on him. That same point how the world function. Margaret performed her calculation in her hand weapon. Amst for medicine, perhaps another amst in worst productivity from Huber Antonio Sare. Assertopel to possible savvy a giro word shulet metu hamsa, bad only if se recovered fully and became a productive worker, muhek se made improbable del in her history. If se recovered but remained weak, se might never be worth more than and metu hamsa or elen and metu, fendering the investment of us. Anter was a delay in ter probability se would DNY, making the enter asser squandered. The intelligent business QS was evident. Margaret hem beheld backwards profitability being making intelligent business decision, being not permitting sentiment to interfere with economics. Don't waste the medicine, she said. Her tongue was firm, fennel. Make her comfortable. If said yes, said yes. dealing well. This was a common expression among slaveholders, after medim to dealing provenance vativ ten tier on nation. Id met ediacerto coachest wade. Drumeret node. Hehan anticipated his response. Hehan proved comparable advice dozens of times, and margered han consistent way forward id mhe squander resources on a fair wing said. Betif to cut your hustle. He gave Sarah a small dose of wardenim, perhaps at murder test point, mero sufficient to deal her discomfort sweating, bed not inoi do wast hill habu medican and somian hanweko to surbil. Ten he left her weighing on the floor and went to have his dinner. It was sust, 0 in the afternoon and just asra amsdi, and she smint meto hamsasdst. Besidst. 0 kumu, a serious condition had worse in significant way. Her Faberham spected hair, her skin now so hope it was almost painful to conduct. Her breathing had become more slow and irregular, McKession waiting until for asra seconds before resuming with her most fat-wing gasp. They hadn't forgotten consciousness. They hadn't moved at all except for occasional voices and conclusions as half body fired its wasing bardu. Drummered kaked and her runs more around sabat, 00 kumo and shook his hand wide kerpendi. They'll begun be morning, probably much sooner, Miami and horror low at most. He informed betting, on off the household civilians how had as distmetu, who served as a maid and occasional nearest, towards the body and inform him when Sarah passed so he called saying he did certified. Beptin sat on a stool in the corner, umsivling his cold day, feeling helpless and sorrowful, but not surprised. Se heb served mijn piopo de aver her salasa at moakkoon. Ged was komma her, effective, au mot fodde. At cement, salasa amst pimo, Sara Sutton said breathing. Her cast, muhik heb men maling in chos sawaw, war brechts, became still. Beptim wide de fiao minigam sifling, better was no monument. Sesem mon drummerate, who came down grum wing about being interrupted during his learning vanning. He kicked for a pause in Sarah's writ. Nyakshin. He held a small hand mirror to her march, watching for condensation from breath. Tiamor vor staying it queer. He pressed his ear to her cast, waiting for a heardmet. Complete silence. Drummered pronounced Sarah desesid at cement, salasa amst pimoya just asra amst and she cement meto hamsasdst. Cas of daj, pinemane complicated by chronic weakness and multiple concriminating factors. He recorded it clarifying in his medical wonder where he kept records of merits, deaths, and treatments at Moakkom. Sara Sutton became entering number arat meto salasa sabatin teat wedger, and of salasa cement deaths he had recorded in his distiar sibling deportation. Most were children or otherwise wives. A few were adults who have been worked to dead or dead from offense or disease. All were not with the same clinical detachment, same effects and failures, that is and case. Margaret was informed who said her dinner. Sibera walked up from her fasted kitchen and gagetabus. Have time behind her behind the baron. No point was staying space in the cemetery, and do it quickly. Tis had well cast the body to deteriorate weapon. Tis was nothing so. In swabid people who died were out and buried weapon in han marget revis, especially children, especially safegunners who hadn't been productive. The young weren't considerable portion of the space or care among provenant or white people or elendo helhabwe adult swavies who had yarnet some meher of respectroy years of harud wabor. Tetemeter Margaret refefensid was veservid for white people and occasionally for actremoi helhabor on sibling swavies who hem bien favorites of the family. It hem proper handstands, minding walks, feignoir attention. The area behind the baron was defeated. It was where detested animals were buried, where broken equipment was discarded, where anything cancelled was deemed and forbidden. Burning Sarah, there was a final inhoud, a vast statement about her worth. Coleman Brails was assigned her task for named her burial. He selected law workers, James and Moses, provided him house, and instructed them to deal a how aratfit deep behind the barren. He dient a coffin. Coffins cost money at West Amsterdam for a basic paying container. That was money Margaret wouldn't was done a code who had cost replenishing more tens produced. Hesem poe hemd him rep Sarex boarding in an out pet of canvas head ans bien he said to cover Coptan Bowes, bet was now do de Megan to be SFO. Te burial donk West Chen and Har. James and Moses, both men in Tiersalassasu, excavated the grave seventhway, working vepinoa in the fanning wade. Tien had buried Piopue before, Tlomain Piopue. The grand behind the barren was soft from previous burials, Yasito dear. Tien diher doan about aratfid, credim behov vai sidistfit wang and huletfit wade, mero burial significant for ser small body. Tien puesid her and the grand, sideo reped in kangas, her fes covered. No keramang, no preners, no hing. Mreirs wouden pyramid it feuja syphilis for suaves hand to be approved and supervised, and he wasn't going to was the tema an a code who hem bien more trouble ten se was word. James and Moses feubbed he dirt back in, covering Sarek's body, packed him it down fought. Biasakum, it was fancy. Sarek Sultan was in the grand, a ratfid of Mississippi soil bedouin her and he world, for job den before the soil had fioi setwig. Esther served from the quarters, tears flowing down her face. Sehab wanted to bid farewell, wanted to was Sarek's body proper way according to the tradition her and when not her ham tait her, wanted to abdere a prayer of her grave. Matse hadn't been permitted. None of the enslaved people have been permitted to participate in the burial. It was done vepinoa, efficiently, without sentiment or respect. Simple another that is a swag, another was to be recorded in the Wedger and forjobden. Daniel Sutton beselaster, his jaw quenkeb so table his stead hatsib. His hands were bowed into fits at his say. Said the served better, he whispered. His voice file wage motion he couldn't express more openly. Said the so much better had he. Estef nodded, weeping her eles. The now desert better, code. Emeron sango person who dies in tif pues deserless better. Biet tis ist he world we inhabit. Tis is we had tien poem were a word. West hen animals, west hen soul. Tien storm terre and delphio darkness, sivling hen marget rev, ebdering ter allen quaid prayers, morning ba killed tien han canon forzet in hers who hem never bien permitted to throw away. Tien tien returnet to chair cabin bekast he work bill woud flying again at amst, 00 amu and tien han to be prepared. Wifed moi quo puente she continue. Te coptan dien sias growing bekasa killed dead. Tewa bor dient pass for grave. Emerating same poi progressed forward as if Sarah had never reached it. Tienakt dang, I just as rasidist di, wife returned don your mouth. Piopua went toward the fields. Coptan was guttured. Parlets were enforced. Margaret recorded Sarah's death in her Wedger wade a simple anchoring. Sara Sutton, a jenen, dead just as ramsdi. And she smint meto hamsasd. Was of a said gauch hulet meto hamsa. Se woud quae medias absence was an her thesis, perhaps fediking her election bene a few dollars. The grave behind the barren was hen marged and aurel beginning to swing sway as the soul setwed and compressed. I just as rasabatif persid senewarwe. Work, hat, a chastion, sweep, repair. Nobody discussed Sarah. This same dad was cancelled unfortunately. And besides, we had was territoich pre. Another killed had dead. Edok prured constantly. Y'all marined if ya cowed. Y'all mowed forward because ya hando, and ya hopped ya wouldn't benekt. Bad on just as rasment di, sust jains after Sarah's bureau, something occurred het woud candy emerating at moak quote pointation. Tene of ya just as rasment di was hot and motionless, the air hemi wade moisture tet promised rain, bet never dewekerer. There was no bre, no very from the oppressive hat Ellen after the sun had said. Most people at Boakwob were as with visiting, zero rukum, adjusted from another brought of the of Wabur. The femme who were still awake, sitting on cell chair cabin, abducting to fame some coaffair, heard it first. A sound had the end bewang. A scraping sound, wake something a skeleting or quawing, coming from the direction of the baron. In a chowing, Tian Choy it was an animal, mine me a doll or vacon assessing something. Bet Tian his sound drew wabber, more deliberate, more purposeful. And the dolls, our sight of Jim had waved around the pointation, started barking, our of Jim, our simultaneously, in a wide head made of sky crow, in a wide head spoke of primo fear that have 10 territorial adjacent. This wasn't your typical barking that an entrainer or another animal. This was different. This was the sound dolly's produce when hand sense something fundamental wrong, something that we noticed in a pure order. Tien barged and howed, vibrating from the baron, hequis awagated, some of Jim Trumwing. And of the dogs affinated in fear, make dogs don't do west tenwe absolutely terrific. James, and of the household civilians, how had at Sabatmatu, who often had named responsibilities, drab made a wandering and went to in the state. Hekaway told her dolls to be cooled, be Tien wouldn't stop, wouldn't alien up fresh him. Tien sim poised down at a distance, condemning him tear fair crest barcame, walking toward something behind the baron head James cowed and said. He walked slowly around the building, holding the wandering hay, his heart padding faster wage as step, chummy he called and each point me. The air felt wrong somehow, colder than it should be, him weighed something he couldn't identify. He summed the gravest first, 3 small monks who had a people have been buried out of the past low months. The soul on the law of Jim was undisturbed, settled and smoke. Bet Terudan, the Weston, Sar's rave, was different. The soil had been disturbed, more than disturbed. There was an opening emerging from Powell, like something had excavated its way out from the interior. And as James drew closer, his heart pounding so intensely he could hear it in his ears. He saw something that made him drop the lantern, that made him scream louder than he had ever screamed in his life. A small hand paw and him onward protruding from his soul. Fingers mulling, grasping, pawing, and pen at the hand, a face covered in dirt, and his open, mouth gasping for air. Sara Sutton was emerging from her grave. James scream pierced the night wake up wide, fuzzing half the plantation. People came fanning from our direction from the swavy quarters and the main house, carrying lanterns and torches, as came, what was wrong. Let occur. We was James screaming like Somia was being murdered. He couldn't respond. He seemed poised on terror pointing at the grave with a second hand. His much malim, mere no words malim. His enes when wait terror and disbelief. Coleman braves arrived first from the adversary's house, pawing on his trousers, caroling his favor, prepared for trauma. He psm tried the gathering crowd, cursing around for the disturbance, demanding to know who had for walk him in the mind of the night. Then he saw who had James was pointing at, and how did completely in his tracks. His faithful wore red Zoe. His face went pale and he torch wide. Behind him, more people got sharp, inswabit workers and wait staff members, our caroling wades, our passing forward to see who had cassettes at combination. The crowd drew the higher, 10 salasa, 10 arba people, our standing in a semicircle around the gravesite, our staring at so matching impossible, so matching that we waited ever napira would hang under stone about wave and dead. Sara Sutton was powering herself. Hip and out of her rabe. Her movements were as well but deliberate, purposeful. Both hands now gripped the edge of the opening, her 10 arms straining as she held herself upward. Dirt fell from her ankles, cascading down the burial canvas that still partially wrapped her small body. Her hair was muddied with soil, thick and dark and moist appearing in the moment. Her dress, the simple suave clothing she had died in, was torn and filthy, stained with sustenance of burial. But her eyes had made everyone involuntarily step backward. Her eyes were open, queer, and focused in a way they never had been during her life. Then she made to go swiftly in the torch wide, perfecting the flames in a way that humanity souldn't. She walked around that out her socked faces staring at her, making any contact with person after person, and in as less was so matching that made grown men and women feel like children can't performing so matching terrible. She powered herself completely from the opening and storm and sacking waves beside her along grave. She was so small, so thin, covered in soul from hand to door, appearing more like a spirit or ghost than a waving cloud. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the dogs continuing their terrified barking from a safe distance and the crackling of torches in the motionless night air. It was impossible. Everyone understood it was impossible. Sara Sutton had been detested. The merit had pronounced her detested sustenance. He had kicked her paws multiple times, held a mirror to her mouth, western to her chest. She had no helmet, no breech, no indication of wave whatsoever. They had buried her at a fat underground with padding cangas. No eye cold and yet grey. No water, no sustenance. A person could not surely being buried for days. It was medically, physically, scientifically impossible. Had her assessed breathing, mauling, away. Esther was the first to break from the crowd. She peasant rolled his standard and walkers and fan to Sara, falling to her knees before the girl. Her hands visible but hesitated, afraid to touch, afraid this was a spirit or awakening, afraid that talking would cast it to harness. Told Sara, is that Troy Hall? Everyone ganging away. Her voice was trembling, tears already streaming down her wet face. Sara walked down at Esther and nodded slowly. When she spoke, her voice was different from before. It was still said, but it carried strange now, carpendi, attenuating it hand never possessed during her short wave. Her vocal cords were raw and damaged from sustenance with hot water, making her voice fine and scratchy. But somehow it had made it more commanding, more safe. Has, Esther, it's ne. Ima way. If eterne. The words wangered in the eye like smoke. If eterne. Njod I awaken it were serbil. If eterne as if that had been a vacation se visited and then departed. As if she had made a choice to veteran what if ten same point never having been found detested. The distinction was subtle, but Emeron persuaded that sense that his was so much more than a medical mistake or miraculous recovery. The merit was ammonia immediately. Someone found was him, pounding on his door until his demon weighed out in his nature, grimming about being disturbed about how plantation owners never wet patient vest properly. He was 7 years old, and rest dient come away anymore. He queried his sweep. Beat wend his land rabbit his arm and narrated him towarud Tiberian, sidem nirang about Sara Sutton being away, Brumaret progressed from annoyed to terrified in seconds. He arrived at the gravesite, breathing heavily from the church, his old heart pounding when he saw Sarah standing terror covered in soil, but queer way away and conscious. His face went pale as cog, his legs narrow gave way. Someone hem to grasp his arm to steady him. He had pronounced her death. He had signed her certificate. He had been absorbing, completing, professing away curding. Yet Teresa was, standing and breathing and walking at him with just training awareness. Grr. Merritt fell forward, his medical training overrailing his fear. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, pressing his fingers against the pulse point. It was present, strong and steady, beating at about 7 beats per minute, perfectly normal for a child her egg. He pressed his ear against her chest, whistling. Her heart was beating vainly. No irregularities, no signs of the failure he had diagnosed just the anesthesia. He peered back her away to examine her pupils. Ten were normal, effective told he torch wide. No sign of the void back that state he had observed. He checked her temperature by pressing his hand against her forehead and neck. She was warm, normal body temperature, not the cold stillness of dead shore the burning fever that had consumed her before. He checked her hands and feet. Wolf was dull. Color was fading. Fingers and toes moved normal and when he requested se weird him. He whistled into her wings. The hand were queer. No forehead, no vertwing, no sign of the pneumonia that had been killing her sabahulet hars erwir. This is impossible, Brumaret to whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Young were detested, a cacked tritemis, fjortemis ailing. All had no pulse, no heartbeat, no breath. Half body was cold. Half anus were fixed and dead. Young were detested behavior and medical standard understand. He was trembling now, his professional curtain disheartened. His entire understanding of medicine and behaving cowed in the question burned his small dirt-covered cold. Sarah walked at him with the square, focused against had seemed fertile matter for her face. It was decided, Brumaret. Half assessment wasn't incorrect. Half examination was accurate. My heart said patting at cement, salasa amst pimoania just asra amst di, my breathing said. Mumbrain said recurring action. It did. Ze spoke with certainty, with kanawend as it in her old deros houden passes. Bet dat isn't always final. Somedimus dat can be reverse. Somedimus who has departed can return. Margaret Sutton arrived hen, rapid in a form despite the hat, her grey hair was around her shoulders, her face showing fury at being fastened into the window of the night. She had been vesting poor waiting, from weight bend rams se couldn't quite recall upon waking, and this disturbance empowered her from the first depth sweep Seb had in days. She peasant the chrome offings with Piope and Steph, demanding to know what was happening. Met a murdering of a quered facing the interpretation at his angled way her. When she saw Sarah away and standing by her grave, Margaret held my sentence. Her much hang pain. Her Venice wane. For several long seconds, she couldn't process what she was saying. Her brain refused to accept it kept insisting this must be someone else, some of her girl. Because Sara Sutton was deceased and buried just the anesthesia. But she recognized her face, Ellen covered in soil. She recognized her small, thin frame. She recognized her torn dress that had been Sarah's unwake walking. Maar levet zich presens hieldet from confession do something dat might have been fear, choice a would never have admitted it. She was a practical woman who believed in facts and figures, in things that could be measured and calculated and controlled. That was final. That is it people vemain that is it. That was a fundamental for of each things. Had here was evidence that coined and that found that suggested validity was more complicated and terrifying than her net wedgers and calculation permitted for. Each point is, Margaret demanded, her voice sharp, but with a tremor handnet that betrayed her composure. So beyond each point is immediately. Dr. Merritt, we had a career. How is it possible? So walked around up the crowd, at the faces showing shock and fear and something else, something that appeared like hope or vindication, each presence at the end appreciated saying on his white face. Grr. Merritt stemde abdimpting to form words, abdimpting to construct an explanation that made sense within his understanding of medicine. She must have been. It could have been catalepsy. A rare condition where the body enters a diatric state, but isn't active and detest. The vital signs become so weak that nearly undetectable. Breathing slow to perhaps on breath per minute. Had met to my feb or sick pets per minute. It mimics that perfectly. You must have either walked it. You must have made an error in my diagnosis. He was grasping at possibilities and ever on understand it catalepsy the end each point how some could surveil sustenance buried underground with no air. Even if Sarah had been in a cataleptic state when buried, she would have suffocated waiting minutes and the soil was poured on top of her. The canvas wrapping would have blocked an amount of air that might have filtered through the soil. There was no medical explanation for it. None at all. Brave stepped forward, his faithful grip painted in his hands. He had recovered from his initial shock, and was now furious, as he always was when confronted with something he didn't understand. And there was yesterday fear. And there was something he understood how to handle. Manibs wasn't completely ideal. Manibs was mirror moved on Dian and awakened in the ground and excavated herself out. But even as he expressed it, he didn't believe he had assisted in burying her. He understood how deep the grave was, how much soil Dian had poured on top. A grown man would struggle to deal out from that depth. A small, in her old derro. Impossible. Sarah walked at commembrates and he acted stepped backward despite himself. Despite his sigh and drainage and the wafer in his hands, there was something in her gaze that stripped away his bravado, that made him feel each posed and harmful. It didn't excavate, more brave. The air faced me. It didn't want me. That sent me back. Her voice was cleared, but it carried. Everyone in the crowd heard her query. He was in darkness for a long time. Cold and one. He couldn't breathe, but he didn't need to. He couldn't move, but he didn't hear. He simply existed in nothing for who had felt wake forever. She turned slowly, wondering that all the faces got shaded around her. Then something spoke to me. I don't understand what it was. A voice whispered son. It expressed a cold vermentary and a darker a cold go back. But if I went back, I would have to complete something. I would have to make things right. I would have to demonstrate to him. She walked directly at Margaret now. Demonstrate to him who had handed. Demonstrate to him who had wear a word. Demonstrate to him that young can simply discard people like refes and expect no consequences. The crowd of inswebbed people started murmuring, whispers spreading like vapors in water. Some medicines alleen still unken gesturet their grandparents have brought it from Africa, some boss men to world of spirits and natural things. Some spirit prayers kawang and jesak or omer that is seeking protection from hedebeft his was. Bead obherus walkie that serif wade something different in teres. Something wake recognition, wake se represented something dian have been anticipating without understanding it because dian or comprehended what dian were saying, even if dian couldn't explain. This wasn't a medical mistake. This wasn't someone awakening from a coma. This was something that shouldn't be possible, but was happening anyway. This was the natural order breaking, pending, permitting something troll that normal and vemayet and the other say. This was resurrection or visitation or possession or something else dying him no destination for. Never it was fair and it was standing before the cowarded red soul. Marlert abdempted to take control of the situation, abdempted to impose her authority and vector the order that made her world function. This is nonsense. A prestige of nonsense. The girl was in a coma or cataleptic state. Girl. Merit made an understandable error in diagnosis. Sorry, young weary extremely ill and confused. You're awakened disoriented and managing to excavate yourself somehow. That's all. This is a medical mistake and an unfortunate survival. Her voice was firm, commanding, but her hands were shaking. Emerald returned to bed. Sarah will be a chaminate proper way in the morning. This incident is concluded. Bed no budging over. Tiana o same place Tom Terry staring at Sarah, waiting to say what's a wow donyact, what's a wow press. The power dynamic had shielded some who in wise Margaret could feel but not quite comprehend. Her words, make normal and would have scattered her crown immediately, had no effect. For the first time in her life, Margaret Sutton sat before and swayed pupil and felt powerless. Sarah walked at Margaret for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried absolute certainty. Her detailing, Sutton told him and told herself, young understand it was that is. Dere married understands. Merbrairs understands. Eberhon here understands. He had no hard met, no breathing. He was cold and stiff. He was detested for 6 days. She took a step toward Margaret and Margaret acted stepped backward. Something se would never normal and do before in swayed pupil. 6 days ago, jag determined it wasn't worth saying. Jag performed the calculation. Amst for medicingerses 250 jaus. Jag calculated that saving me wasn't a sound investment. The crowd was completely silent now. Emerald Westening, everyone observing this small could confront the most powerful person and the pointation without fear, without deference, without resignation that him being patterned into him science beard. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. Y'all assigned a price to my wife and determined it wasn't sufficient. Y'all permitted me to to save amst. Y'all buried me behind the barren wake a decessed animal because y'all pewed it was worthless. Margaret's face was red with hunger and humiliation. That's not how we'd occur. That's not medical decades are complicated. The treatment wouldn't have succeeded. Y'all were it all far gone. You made a practical decade based on expert guidance. But her voice was defensive, wakefing its so assured because Sarah was correct. That was exactly how it had been. Margaret had performed her calculation and determined Sarah wasn't worth the expense. Sarah smiled and it was not a cold smile. It was kinawang banken caroling where that news that in her old sound passes. You understand me hat im words now, Sutton. Synods, Immerward more 10 your anker pointation. Immerward more 10 averting young passes beckas a veteran from dead. You walked in darkness and veteran at doorwayed. I crashed at Rishon tet no on crasses and ten crashed it alien going the opposite direction. Yam prof tet nor calculations are remaining ways, tet nor wedgers don't capture wet matters, tet yon don't control averting yon bewe beyond control. Seft ended her arms well, just ring at the crown around her. We are our words more tend to press yon asinto his. Emeran signed a person here. We're not ingenkory. We're not assets. We're human beings with souls and dignity. And the veteran to probe it. If veteran to demonstrate to everyone we had young Troy we had young dead, we had your do a very sanguine do our office. Marlert abdimpted to speak, made no words a Marie. So painted her much and quased it elaine, her face hankwing Troy each present of fed, fear, and confessing. So walked around at her crown, at her adversary, at her position, seeking support, seeking someone to support her, to restore order. Beat Proels was staring at Sarah with buried concealed fear. Diremeret was trembling, pau as dach, hinabo to rekanka uhet he was saying which aberating he pewe with he understone about medicine. And the inswabid pupua were walking at Sarah with his present tet terrified marjored more ten and I think elsie. The were walking but here with hope, with pewev, with the quimb of dandruff fed tet cold went of Febioin, to praying, told the complete collapse of the system that kept Jim controlled. Hope was the most dangerous things waves called passes. Hope made him cease accepting their condition. Hope made him spared imagining alternately. Hope made him willing to risk emirating for the opportunity at so much better. Mraev's finally found his choice, abdimpted to assert control in the unwavering he understood, through mich treffs and viewings. He vested his favor, pointing it at Sarah, his finger on the trigger. Text a ficken. Your bond address Maris sort and het why. Hor still property. Hor still a swaggy. Y'all don't get to make speeches and accusation. This is concluded immediately. Hor going to his acid because Sarah was walking at him. Truma walking at him. And here eyes had tangy. Them were darker now, deeper, wake am sivling into wheels wait no boredom, wake am sivling into the white bedouin sitters. Her people semeb to each band and you'd hang consummed the weights of her relis, indeed there was nothing but darkness walking out from her small face. Young struck me manitimus, murbrers. Y'all called me virtuous. Y'all expressed is how dear. Y'all expressed was stealing fog being away. Y'all were accurate about the delaying part. Her voice hand candid, till, deeper with harmonics that the same do originate from himangakal chords. Bet y'all were incorrect about emirating else. Mraev's poem the trader. Tis hot fang out wab in the need, the mihuf was bright as whitening, tis on the chewing of the baron and chemang has. Everhon screamed or diaked or doi for cover. The shot was point boing, mine as and Brers was known as an excellent marksman who called sort of heavyweight at Hamsahards. Biabti bjawed dien sprake Sare. It struck the grand sustfid to her weft, giving hip a small sprain of soul. Brave sparried at his favor in confession, in disbelief. Ho heb he misse. Ho was het possible. He vested the refor alone, I made more careful his stem, his hands second. But his aim steady. He ferred in. His hope went he, mistwing over Sarah's hand at west lufed. He ferred a terror dim, a forged him, impting the weather. Emery's hot my said. Emerin sanguine, despite perfect aim, despite a stationary period, despite years of sodding experience, the poets went everywhere except where it hung where I made as if so me invisible force was defecting him. Bembem their trajectories up the final moment. Sara walked toward Braille's way. Hefet rapid, his hands sacking so intensely now had robbed him the favor. His face displaying pure terror. Out the bravado and crowding prepared a wine, wearing just a frightened man confronting something he couldn't understand or control. Staying away from me. Staying away. He turned and went toward his house, stimming over his own feet, not walking back, fanning wake a cold flame beneath me. Sara didn't pierce him. Se simply observed him depart, Herrick pressing calm, almost sorrowful. Tense walked at the crumb of his webby pupil, and Herrick pressing softened. When she spoke alone, her voice was like to normal, or as normal as it could be given to circumstance. Immer not here to herum han, en of han. Immer not a monster or a demon or a nightingale. Same poisare. But something occurred to me in those 3 days. Something transformed me, revealed things to me, proved my purpose. So walked at Marjorie Lane. Hereford he honest who injured us. The honest who determined our ways don't matter. The honest who treat his wake animals or property or numerous in a waiter. It begins with him. Se pointed at Margaret. It begins with the people who performed her calculations, who determined who ways and who dies best and profit and was, who create a system where a code's wave is worth was 10 stuff made him. Marjorie finally found her voice, she had a married sake and wig. Holler insane. Holler a code having delusions from trauma and a shedding depression. Some men say her and confine her and he barren until morning. We all managed his who never had think queer. But nobody wanted to say sorry. Nobody wanted to touch her. Elend her with staff members, who normally would have jumped to obey Margaret's orders, storm frozen, in willing to upfresh his small girl who had quelled her way from a grave. Sara walked around that hour of Chim and Mortem, her guess wingering and Esther, and Daniel, and the other enswiped people who had known her, who had observed her suffer, who had mourned her death. If it returned to make things fade, to demonstrate to everyone her truth. It won't be quick, and it won't be simple, but it will work. Justice is upfreshing more competition. The claim of justice that don't conquering itself with property law for economics. The claim that balances the scales regardless of heated courts. Hence turned and walked slowly toward his wavy quarters, toward the cabin they had serried Winchester. The crown parted to permit her Troy, people stepping as en vepinoa, not wanting to walk her path. Some feathered as if to touch her, but withdrew their hands at the final moment, afraid or reverent, or both. Sara walked with her hand elevated, her back straight, mulling with a confidence and dignity had never displayed in life. She appeared like someone who had nothing remaining to fear because she had already experienced the worst thing possible and survived it. She entered the cabin and went down on her sweeping mat, the same mat where she had swept for the hers, where she had died in spirit long before her body gave out. Esther followed her in cell, not understanding what else to do, needing to be near his code she had attempted to protect and failed to save. Sara closed her eyes and waiting minutes appeared to be sweeping, half breathing deep and faint, her face passive in a way it never had been before. Esther sat beside her, staring at the girl who had died and somehow returned. She about carefully and thought of Sara's face, half expecting her hand to pass Troy as if Sara was a spirit or host. But his coin was solid and warm, fearless and warm, he must get away. Had when Esther withdrew her hand, terror was soil on her fingers. So from the grave, yard that had covered Sarah's body for 6 days, dear that sound heavy been her vesting pues. And Esther understood deep in her heart, in the part of her that vekaweg ouder pewifs her grandmother hem tait her before Christianity abdimpted to vepwest him, that Sarah had spoken het rat. Ze had died. Ze had been so meuhere aus, so meuhere been ontwef. And ze had veteran for a purpose. Die detzesse dient veteran without intention. Dien veteran et went her aware debits and setweb, went justice heb been daneb, went his kawes fequered bawenking. On sale, die crown zoa disperse. Pupwe veteraning do chair cabinth, bad understanding sweep would be impossible. Tien would way entire beds and stare abtekewing and vepwend had tien ham witnessed, abdimpting to make sense of it, abdimpting to feed it into chair understanding of how the world function. Some would pray, some would weep. Some would feel hope for the first time in years. Hope that my chair suffering wouldn't last forever. That my chair aware forces in the universe that carried about justice even when humans didn't. Marlerts don't because her has am sivling the quarters. Her mind wekken. Tis hem to be explained, hem to be vectionalized, hem to be confounded before it's pre-and beyond the pointation. People didn't veteran from the den. That was superstition, ignorance, cursed rod, primitive beliefs. Ter hem to be a wavikovich poination, catawipsin, primabri bureo, somehow excavating so matching scientific that made sense waiting the nebula wows, se understone. Bed in her heart, in the part of her that still pelewed in things beyond money and property and profit, in the part se abdimpted do in or because it interfered with business, Margaret understood so matching teremo habakuri. So matching hams hilded at moaquom pointation on his hot just need. Tienapiro order have bien violate. Tiedeset had veteraned and mhedeber forward nact. Mehdeber consequences followed from that impossible correction would not be waiting her confo. Diremeret sat in his form, staring at the that certificate he had signed sust dian sejo. Tipeper semeb do mock him, ever a word proof of his failure, even instead his carpendi have been misplaced, that his professional jihadment was virtuous. Sara Sutton, ejizating, dead at cement, Salasa amst pimania just asra amst di, and she cement meto hamsasd. Kias pinemone and systemic failure. He had signed it, dated it, recorded it in his Wedger Wade hub so it confiding. But Sara Sutton was not dated. She was sweeping in the quarters fate no, breathing and away. He had been incorrect or submitting impossible have a career. Either one, his hands wouldn't say second. Either one, his entire understanding of medicine and that and the beyonderen bedwin him had been satire. He extracted a bogdo of whisken, submitting he very incogedin, and poured himself a large dose. He needed to dehold he fear, needed to siest hanging about what he had seen, needed to folded the walking sarix ns when such pressed, he was deathest. Coleman Braves barricaded himself in his form, piecing furniture against the door, warding every weapon he possessed. He had sake favors now varian dilu pistols au hoided and premig. He kept the lamps burning, terrified of the dark, terrified of light might be hiding in shadows. Emery sound met him jump. Emery crack of the floorboard sounded wake fox tips. Emerald monument of curtain in the brick appeared like a small figure standing in the corner. He told himself he wasn't afraid of a kid. He had broken grown men, he had petting people who waited for mercy, and way he was doing it he was strong, powerful, feared benever on and pointation. But that time he had seen, chose ns walking at him, that voice promising consequences, that wasn't a kid. Tep was something else wearing a kid's face and it understood his transgression. It understood every dime he had struck her, a very insult he had spoken, a very moment of cruelty. It vekawed our feed, and it had vajrunit to collect payment. As down up fretebane just as razet ingdi, Moakwom Puendation sat in and Hanesinkuled had felt more threatening tenan and wahad disturbance. Tesan wawd reson, pendim dhiskain feds and rendeth. Pupur wawd habito joto de fields. Wabur wawd habito kanching. Koptan needed gathering figurdress of lihet impossimo tanks accurate in tenade. Mardert wawd abdimpito reftor order. To make everyone for little head ham saying, touch point ideawang as medical error and mass history and nothing more. Yet tiang au handrestormed he trot. Something had veteraned from death. Something had recovered ever recruiting, a mirror injustice, a mirror calculation had used profit over human wife. Something had promised consequences. Tab spoke of justice and balance and damaged had required payment. And whether it was Sara Sutton returned from the grave or something else saying her body, the result was identical. Moakwom Puendation would never be identical alien. The morning of a just as razet in the rain and heavy. The Sfang covered in quads tap threatened rain but delivered none. Yet same poiham terror oppressive and dark, wake at telling pressing dawn. The eye felt thick, difficult to breathe, carried wide so much electrical and run. The Puendation felt different, appeared different, joy nothing physical hand kanged. It was fed no spare, the sensation, wake the wind itself understone something terremo have macquarid and was waiting to say we had forward. Nyakt. Tibel fang at amst, zero was so wise, simlaning pupil told the fields. Bit this morning, mine were verkten to wave chair cabin. Tien guttered in small groups, whispering, dwanking toward the cabin her Sara swept, afraid to up fresh, bed hinabo to walk away. The bravest among them up fretted Aster's cabin and peered through the gaps in the walls, attempting to say if Sara was still there. If se was veel, if was need hen actewing occurred, or was some serried feber dream broihed and benehet and digestion and desperation. Sarah was terror, sweeping pacifying, her cast weighing and following wade fenwar breads. Se appeared normal in the morning wade, same way a small girl who needed to was the soul from her hair and squine. Beadeveron who walked at her felt it had sense of fungus. Tet awareness tet his was not the same Sarah who had dared sust the ansejo. Something fundamental hand transformed. Something essential was different. Margaret Sutton had not swept at all. She sat at her desk in the main house, still in half-natured his, sparing at her wages, but not Troy saying the numbers. Her mind kept planning the impossible side of that code emerging from her grave, walking and talking after being detested for just days. Margaret was a practical woman who believed in facts and figures, in things that could be measured and calculated and controlled. That was final. Detested people remained detested. That was a fundamental flaw of existence, possibly the most fundamental flaw. Had met se hem witnessed hem mimoted that fall so completion, so handable that it soaked the foundation of everything se believed. If that wasn't final, if the detested could return, if the nebula was depended and could be broken so easily, then Matthews was incorrect about. Met other curtains were illusion. Net other files made Pandor break hem presse. At sidist. 00 amu, se Simon drummerit and Coleman brails to met her and his steady. Se needed to discuss his situation, needed to formulate a plan, needed to assert control before things spiraled further. Drummerit arrived appearing terrible, his eyes fed and blobs up, his hands trembling as he poured himself coffee from the syphilis Margaret's house suaves ham prepared. He had a get a serial saverned. His face brown and hellard, his confidence saturated. Miraelis was worse. Her revid asra minutes wet, week was unprecedented, caroling dulo hoided pistols opinway and his pelt and a fefo over his shoulder. His NS were wild, darding around constantly, perceiving threats in every shadow. He had dark request hand of his NS from work of sweep. His house wajger was gone, verpoised benanarlos annoying and burial confoid fear. He sat across from Margaret's desk, beat Woden pat down his weapons, keeping him close, fearing, Diane sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Margaret spoke, her voice firm, but with a tremor underneath that betrayed her composure. We need to confront his situation before it worsens. Before words press beyond the point action, before we have a few panic, or worse, a feeble. So walked at both men, demanding their attention, demanding the fox. The official account is that Sarah was in a capable state. The married made an understandable diagnostic error. She recovered and excavated herself. That's what we aim for everyone. That's led Joyce in our office of records. The married nodded eagerly, grateful for an explanation that didn't require him to admit he had witnessed so much impossible. His curtailment. Catalepsy. It's rare, but documented in medical literature. The body enters a death state. Without science become nearly undetectable. It would have recognized it would have been more thorough in my examination. Men mistake enter. He was deceiving himself and understood it but was weary as if he thought me and abandoning everything young with young understood about the world. Mraes went forward, his jaw tight. We had about let such pressed about returning from Dutch about making things fade. Set written it your directly, Mom. That can't be permitted. Se required severe punishment. Needs to be solved such immediately before se cases gain trouble before se infects the others with her incentaug. His voice carried desperation, the need to remove the source of his fear to make the threat disappear. Margaret considered his saying Sarah would remove the immediate problem from Wacom, but it would also spread the account. Every pointation Sarah went to, every slave trader who hand with her, every enslaved person who heard about her would hear the tale of the girl who died and veteran. The account would spread wake would fertile slave communities across the Soch, passed along the invisible networks of communication that moved information faster than an telegraph. That kind of account was dangerous. It would inspire hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing enslaved people could possess. Hope made them cease accepting their condition. Hope made them believe in alternateless impossibilities beyond their current suffering. Hope called them to resistance, to escapism, to rebellion that would cost Margaret everything. The nature of rebellion had a mysterious hand started with a man who believed God had chosen him for a special purpose. Yet my occur if enslaved people across the South started believing that inherent thereof being reflected to bring justice to their oppressor. New Margaret declared firmly. She remains here where we can control her, where we can control the account and enter it doing spread beyond the pointation boundary. If she sold, the tale grows with a meritoing, becomes wilder and more dramatic. Here, we can manage it, we can answer people understand it was a medical error. Nothing supernatural, nothing that would inspire hope or resistance. So walked at both men with determination. Sarah is all, confessed, traumatized from her experience of being buried alive. She is expressing things that don't make sense because her mind was damaged by sharing deprivation. Which read her wage patchings and quenties. Demonstrate to everyone that we're reasonable and compassionate. We prove that her accusations are the ravings of a confessed code. Tes ho would managed he. Beadevenas Margaret spoke tes words wade confiance, Elenas te true of chem no dead in agreement about the officer account, tiang au handrestone tian weir deteving himself. Tian han au sen sarex enes, heb heard the carpendi in her voice, heb felt the wonders of her presence. This wasn't a confessed kill. This wasn't medical error or a sudden deprivation. This was something else endeavor. Something that didn't fade into their comfortable explanations and versatile worldview. At Sabat, 00. Marlert Simman Sari. Esther Brahid Hegero told him main has, while going swaway. Sarah's small hand in her wetterigan. The killed had been wasab, the grave soul vemowed from her hair and skin, dressed in quen him. In the morning wade, while going into the plantation has, se appeared almost normal, simply at hangs it in her old dero, small for her ready, nothing special or frightening about her. But when se entered Margaret's study, when se stoned across her desk from the woman who owned her, who had determined se wasn't worth saving, the atmosphere in the warm hanged. The temperature seemed to drop. The air felt heavier. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed dimmer, filtered through something invisible, but present. Margaret felt it, Braves felt it, the Margaret felt it, that sense of being in the presence of something that sound in the chest. Margaret did Sarah Carifon, searching for some sign of the terrifying fear from was need, searching for evidence of disease or damage that would support her explanation of trauma and confessing. But Sarah walked back at her with calm, queerness, eagerness in a young face, in a state had sent things Margaret couldn't imagine, in a state jagged and found her defeating. Sarah, Margaret began saying her gentlest voice, the tones reserved for important jests or difficult negotiation. All provenidius are quite afraid was need. Grr. Merit informs me yon were extremely ill han entered a kind of deep sweep cowed catawipes and had made yon appear deathesque. It's scary where, bad it occurs. Of mind and body's head down to pressure wave. Tes suheno pewe with your head ye. Tes suheno buredion. It was an error. A terrible error, bad and understandable one. Margaret went forward, abdumpting to Sam concerned and carrying vative den kauknoiding. No, I understand yon expressed some things was need that were inappropriate, about delaying and returning, about making things fade, about justice. I understand yon were confused and frightened. Y'all ham just awakened buried away, muik would terrifying han, especially when killed. Your mind was scrambling to make sense of a traumatic experience, so it created his narrative about death and resurrecting. Sesamawid, abdumpting do appear warm and motorway, and expressing Ted sat aujuarodol and her hasawan staring face. Beat Ted's not let Troy occur. Yon were never reactive deaths. Yon were yo, extremo yo, and yon entered his special kind of sweep. Dr. Merritt made an error weak head up with regrets. Nubired yon been mistake. Y'all awakened, managed to achieve yourself somehow, and yon got recovering. That's tetrot. That's let active what occur. Don't you understand? Sarah walked at Margaret with short blowing him, her voice steady and unwavering. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried perfect clarity. Already telling me, yourself, everyone. Y'all understand it was that is. Her simply afraid to admit it because it breaks her understanding of how the world function. Because it so that there are forces larger than young, powers her don't control, consequences young can't calculate away. Margaret's jail today. That's a faking. I'm abdumpting to be patient with young, abdumpting to understand that you're confused and traumatized, but young will not address me that way. Your are killed and not remain property. Yon way or display proper respect. Beadelen as sketch preceded, the words felt how powerless. How do young children someone who has already dead? How do young control someone who has nothing remaining to fear? Sarah tilted her hand sweating, studying Margaret as Margaret might study a problematic entering in her wedger. I don't despise yom, Murasortan. I proba boys howd, bad I don't. I understand yon. You're a product of them, of his system. Yom were that people wake me are property, that or waves have monitoring house and nothing more. All doing we had yom peweb is fade, we had make a sense waking of worldview. Set talk a step closer to her desk and Margaret rested her toe went back to create more distance between him. Be it her incorrect. And we had accurate tone. Niet each parented progress her incorrect. Idiot because young calculated that saving me would cost more than it was worth. Amst versus hulet me to hamsa. Hensand investment. Not worth it permit her to die. Sarah's voice remained calm, almost conversational, make some who made her words cut deeper. Y'all assigned a price to man wife. Y'all do it every day wait ever on her. Y'all calculate war house as if we're a wavesta correct make men. But hina and waves don't have prices, Murasortan. They're infinite. They're precarious. And when you treat them as commodities, when you permit people to die aver money, there are consequences. Margaret stormed abruptly, her care scraping word when against the warning for. You will not be vectored by a killed. You will not be made to feel guilty for making practical business decisions. Thief pointation don't operate on sentiment and feelings. It operates on mathematics and economics. Resources are limited. Choices have to be made. Not everyone can be saved. That's fairly. You're accurate, Sarah sighed, her voice maddeningly calm. Resources are limited. Choices do have to be made, but the choices young make different who young are. The different also. And young choose to pyramid as it in your old little to derivative 10 spend amstan medican. That choice each presses everything about who young are, Murasortan. That choice will come kennel ya for the remainder of your life. Set your net to depart, 10 pass it up the door. Young encouraged what he went, mehne veteran. If veteran to make young say, to make young understand what young done, what you do every day. If veteran to be a mind of that young can simply arrest people who aren't profitable enough. If veteran to hand your conscience and you young enter transform or it destroys young. Sarah walked out of this deity, waving Margaret standing terratrum wing wade vague and fear and so matching else veffiset to in anything. Behind her, Brails was pale and sweating, his hands and his petals, appearing like he wanted to shoot Sarah, but was too afraid to abdimpt out there was Nate's fear. The remote was sparing at his hands, up the instruments of his profession that him proving himself for denouncing the most significant patient he had ever examined. Teacher of him sat silently for a long time after Sarah left. Following, Mrair spoke, his voice fine. We should kill her tani. Make it appear like an accident. A fowl, a snake bait, something natural. Says to dendrot to web away. Says going to dethrone everything here. Margaret considered he. And the fact chaps as if Yahweh considered murdering as it in her own code demonstrated how fair Dian had fallen, how desperate Dian had become. But says so her hen. No, killing her would make her a murder. Would make the account alien larger and more powerful. This is it, se becomes a wagon. Away, says simply a confessed code we can discredit of them. Sedient abdu had se a west roach hanging. Tiet abdimpting to keo sarech maed nyot siksik. Tiet poets maiset herfor vesont tien koudent ich poeng. Tiet mind se koudent be koed be njurmog mens. Betef nyopcho abdimpet and farewell. Better to pretend everything was normal and hope that elenchawang pupwa woud forled, tet wef woud vegerin to fadin, tept his woud au fed into memoran wake a bad dream. Bet mo quo pointed shem woud never be normal alien. Tienect feudans proud het ben undobbed. The trend tanks sparbed makkering, small tanks in a joint het called be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Dolis fefithet to fetch Sara. Tien woud bark at her from a distance, bet woudent up fetch Eliam who commanded, Eliam who tempted wade form. Tien woud cower and himper if forced quas to her, sinorts, terteus Jacob, ter bodies tremwing. Horses became skates who hence passed. Well trained animals chat never spoke it woud suddenly VR and up to board if Sarish cam wait higher feed of chim. Depoindation hand to says a saying curbing pads beckas horses fefis do up fetched his wavy harders who here a Sarah waved. Event he quickens facted strangely. The ounce was cop was caused to Sarah's cabin said one engales. Tien woud pass narluawe, fefising to fort. My kind dead reset sons dying and need. After sust dies, tien hand to be verkated do a different vacation before tien dized from sidris. 2 points and he field where Sarah hand co-episode began to wader. A section about higher feed across turned brown and dear despite at quiet water and careful tending. Tie copta boss srivewig. Tie webes curwed and fell off waiting awake. That spot was completed barren how everything around it grew normal. Workers have went that area, visited the work terror, elang hen or derb, quaiming hen felt surveyed or threatened, quaiming the ground itself rejected him, and people started becoming yo. It began with Brumeri. On a just hiadish, just on dying out their Sarah's veteran, he developed a persistent comedy. Bed he higher and sit he had a feber. Made he higher huletnid he was in bed streetwing to bread. Tessanumtums appeared a chapter wake pneumonia, the same desestate hand quawait Sara. Dr. Marret, weighing in his beb, westending to flame beholding in his wangs, fekagnebd his symptoms wait vrouwing horror.